Good evening, everyone. I'm Shannon Harden. Want to thank you all for coming out this evening. This is the second session that we are hosting of four as the next step of MBK. Yesterday we had our breakout session was on poverty and economics and how we as a community can come together to come up with solutions for our young boys of color in that area. Tonight is around safety, and so we specifically invited you here as folks that are are engaged with supporting young men of color in the space of safety. We intend this to be an engaged conversation. We're going to break out. We're going to hear first some stats and just where we are, but then we are going to kind of do a deep dive and have facilitated conversation for a little bit to get us to our next step. And maybe I should back up to kind of tell you how we got here. Of course, MBK was started out of President Obama's administration, charged cities with coming up with solutions and opportunities for young boys of color in cities. I came on as a co-chair in 2014. Within Mayor Coleman, the first thing that we did right out the door was engage young boys of color. 12 to 24 range. We did it at 4 high schools. We talked to 500 young men of color. The cool thing about that, and a lot of folks in this room actually were a part of those sessions, we used 100 black male mentors, facilitators to have those conversations. Ask them very basic questions. What are your obstacles to success? How can this city, how can this community be supportive to you? And what are those barriers? They gave us what we produced in was called the Youth Perspective Report, and that has been the backbone, the guiding document that has led us to where we are in November of 2017. When we wrote out the Youth Perspective Report, we brought in Broderick Johnson, who was President Obama's director of MBK. Senator Brown came, and I tell this story about we did this awesome rollout, a couple hundred people there. Broderick went on stage and did everything that us elected officials love in saying how great we were for doing this. And then when he got off the stage, he said, he actually used some pretty strong language, and I won't use them, but he said this would be bullcrap if you don't have data and metrics behind it. And so it's just fluff. And so we had to then reevaluate what we were doing. And it was because of that that we reached out as a city, and I'm going to throw it to my council colleague, President Pro Tem Tyson, in a second. Because of their support, we were able to work with Kerwin to go out and do an assessment. Where are we as it pertains to young boys of color when it comes to safety and health and education and poverty? Where are we? What are the baseline? Where's the data at to show where we're starting from? Who is doing this work? So we did asset mapping. Who's doing the work in the community? Who should we have around tables? Who should we be engaged with? Who should we be creating synergies with? And it was important for us to get that data so that we could then create the metrics. And so that brings us to this evening. The overall goal for what we're coming up with is we, again, because of the support of council, are going to set aside some funds next year in a grants type program. We need the grants dollars to be informed by, one, the data that we have, but then by folks who work in this space to tell us how we should create the criteria in which those grants should be engaged in the community. And so the conversation that we'll have this evening, again, are a part of 4 conversations. We will go back as a team, take those and turn that into a grants program. And we'll be talking about this more when we actually roll out the full Kerwin report on My Brother's Keeper. But you guys are just getting a snapshot as it pertains to safety this evening. What I said yesterday is what I will say tonight, that we will also give you the dates for the other 2 conversations. The other ones are education and health. We're having those next month. Certainly would encourage you to come. Also to let us know if there are other folks that need to be in the room to help us come up with this to move us to the next step. But I, in short, am very grateful for each and every one of you for the work that you are doing in this space. You are saving lives every day, every one of you in this room, and we as a city are grateful, but we have work to do. With that, want to thank again first, so the folks that are up here, we have Josh and Kyle from Kerwin who are going to take us and go through the data for us. We have Javier Sanchez who will help facilitate the conversations. First I would let Director Carla Williams-Scott speak, and then followed by President Pro Tem Tyson.
Thank you, Councilmember Harden. And again, I echo his sentiment. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. The Department of Neighborhoods will be working with Council to work through the grants program for the MBK initiative. And we, like as the council member said, we want to hear from you. We want to make sure that what we're doing is what the young people need, because we can all sit around and say what we think they need. But unless we look at the data and hear from the young people, then are we actually getting what it is they need? So again, I thank you all for being here this evening, and looking forward to the conversation.
President Pro Tem Tyson.
Thank you. Again, first I want to say thank you to my council colleague, Shannon Harden, for leading this effort. It is important that we're all supportive as members of council, but certainly every proposal, every program that we initiate, we need to make sure we have a council member that's leading the effort, and that's Councilmember Harden. And we're very pleased to be working with the Kerwin because we know that they're going to give us some great data and to help us to get the metrics that we need to move forward. I also want to thank one of my colleagues who isn't here that chairs safety as a committee on council, and that's Councilmember Mitchell Brown. He had a family emergency and could not be here today, but certainly he is very much committed to making sure that our community is safe, and certainly our young men of color are safe. And so again, just I thank you for being here today. I think that you could have decided to be other places this evening. You chose to be here to be in discussion, to give us more data. You're on the ground to help us to make sure we're getting the information we need to support young men of color. And so thank you. I'm glad that you're here. Look forward to working with you, and look forward to all the results from these meetings for us to move forward.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Tyson. With that, we'll jump right in with Kyle and with Josh with the MBK report.
Good evening. Thank you, President Pro Tem Tyson, Director Williams-Scott, and of course, Councilmember Harden, and all of you for being here today. So we want to kind of open the door to renewing our call to action. As Shannon mentioned, this is one of the instances where all of us need to make sure that we're continued in this effort, but we have to make sure that we're grounded in data. And so the Kerwin Institute began this effort to really take a look at where are our vulnerable youth, and what exactly does vulnerability even mean. So first, one of the pieces at the Kerwin Institute, we want to make sure that we know where we're at in Columbus, because we know that place matters. And if you look at this racial distribution map of the youth population aged 0 to 24, you can see that there is a clear divide between the east and west sides of the city of Columbus. Now, this divide is not immune to Columbus. This is something that nationally is a pattern and part of racial and residential segregation that has happened over generations, as well as still continues to permeate in today's society. Now, as this map illustrates, with each census tract, that is the predominant race of each census tract on the east and west side. But as this map illustrates with place matters is the fact that there are certain differences that are going to happen with life outcomes based on where you're living. And so as a result, we wanted to take a look at what exactly do those differences manifest in when it comes to vulnerability. And the question we asked ourselves at Kerwin is, what exactly does vulnerability mean? So we define vulnerability as the cumulative product of encountering environmental and personal stressors. So environmentally, these stressors can heighten vulnerability from structural stressors, institutional, and then as well as being interpersonal, such as implicit and explicit biases. And these biases are triggered as emotional stressors in the environment around youth. So we want to be very clear. Youth growing up in vulnerable neighborhoods, it is not among the youth themselves, but rather the toxic stressors that exist in a particular environment. And so at Kerwin, we wanted to figure out, how do we calculate vulnerability? So over the past 10 years, the Kirwan Institute has been invested in research of social indicators of opportunity. So we've done this thing called opportunity mapping, which highlights how a particular area has access to resources, access to other sorts of opportunities. And conversely, we're looking at vulnerability, to look at where youth are most vulnerable in these specific areas. And so as a result, we chose 4 domains that are critical to life outcomes. As Councilmember Harden mentioned, we took a look at domain of education, economics, health, and safety. These 4 domains are critical, and we also know that they're interrelated. So one domain of your life outcome is going to be affected based on another. But as a result, we wanted to look at these 4 domains of vulnerability. And Josh is going to highlight just a few of these domains and the indicators that were chosen based on social and economic census data that highlight neighborhood level characteristics.
Yeah, so we chose these 16 indicators because we felt like each of them sort of informed our understanding of vulnerability and informs children's life chances. So within the domain of education, we have 3rd grade reading proficiency, high school graduation rate, student mobility rate, the rate that children move from place to place, student attendance rate, teacher attendance rate, and young adult educational attainment. Within the domain of economics, we have the poverty rate, the housing cost burden, median household income, and the unemployment rate. Within health, we have the health insurance percentage, the modified retail food equity index, MRFEI, and life expectancy at birth. And the reason that y'all are here today is that we have the safety domain, which is the prison incarceration rate, violent crime rate, and gun violence rate. And not only were these indicators available, they also are able to be mapped spatially. So it's not enough just to know what the rates are within Columbus. As Kyle said, place matters. And we understand that vulnerability is distributed unequitably within Columbus. And because of that, we spatially mapped it on the city of Columbus.
And so, as this is spatially mapped out, so just to be clear, so we have 16 indicators, and we put them all together in one index, and we've rated them on the scale of 1 to 5. So low, very low vulnerability, which is a 1, and then 5, which is very high vulnerability. And as a result, you'll actually be able to see when this is mapped out where the most vulnerable areas are. You likely can predict them just by basis of knowing kind of the areas where neighborhoods are most vulnerable, and you'll see what this looks like on a map right here. And I also want you to keep in mind the map that we showed from the beginning of the racial divide in Columbus. So this component only is made up of these 16 indicators, and this is what it looks like.
So as you can see, vulnerability is the highest in areas such as Linden, the Hilltop, the Near East and Far East Side, and the South Side. And if you put this into conversation with the map of how race is distributed, you can see that there's a high overlap between places with a large African American population and vulnerability. However, I want to be clear that there's nothing inherent to the African American experience or being African American that makes children vulnerable. Rather, it's the sum total of the different indicators that we have used to map onto the space that is Columbus.
And systematically, this is also important to keep in mind because, again, as place matters, so does history. And understanding that the policies and procedures that were put in place decades ago, in addition to history of disinvestment and discrimination, has led to the policies where we're at and where these outcomes and youth of color and boys and young men of color in particular are facing cumulative disadvantage. So one of the things that we wanted to do was ensure that we could get a sense of what vulnerability looks like, but also what does it look like when it's overlaid with these racial demographics or gender demographics in a particular community.
So here are some of the key findings from our report. Youth of color are 18% more likely to live in a neighborhood experiencing high or very high vulnerability. White youth are 62% more likely to live in an area of low or very low vulnerability. So there's a clear divide between where the race of children living in specific areas and how they experience vulnerability. 1 in 10 white early childhood and K-12 youth live in neighborhoods with very high vulnerability, as opposed to 1 in 5 early childhood and K-12 youth of color living in neighborhoods with very high vulnerability.
Yeah, and the reason this is also especially important is because it highlights the need for an initiative like My Brother's Keeper and the need to really affect boys and young men of color and other youth of color that are facing these issues, which is why our approach in making sure that we're grounded in data has really been about the focus on 2 main themes, which is raising the bar, which is lifting outcomes for all youth, as well as closing the gap. And so as a result, if we can raise the bar for all youth, we can compare how Columbus youth compare on selected social and economic indicators to the national, state, county, and local averages in order to figure out how we and all of you in this room can work together to raise the bar for all of youth. But we understand that raising the bar is not enough on its own. We also have to figure out ways where we can close the gap. And by closing the gap, we can actually track disparities that exist at the neighborhood level, so these very high vulnerability areas and these very low vulnerability areas, and we can actually focus on disaggregated data by race and gender so that the community can actually work together, all of us, to eliminate some of these disparities. So first, we're going to show what it looks like by raising the bar and actually show the data of where we stand today. Now, again, this data is based on census data, ACS census data.
Okay, within raising the bar, you can see that within Columbus, with the United States mean for jail incarceration rate is 3.4. The Ohio mean is 2.4. Franklin County mean is 2.9, and the Columbus City mean is 4.4. Actually, let me stand up so that way y'all can see what I'm talking about. This is right here. So this is the United States mean. This is the Ohio mean. This is the Franklin County mean. This is the Columbus City mean. So as you can see, the Columbus City mean is almost double the Ohio mean in terms of jail incarceration rate. Oh, there's a mic. Oh, I should have used this in the first place. Excuse me. I don't even think it's on. Does this matter? Okay, it doesn't matter. All right. For the violent crime incidences per 1,000, the United States mean is 3.0. The Ohio mean is 2.9. Franklin County mean is 4.2, and Columbus City mean is over double the United States mean at 6.7. Now, in gun crime incidences, it was difficult to find the national data, but we have a 2.2 per 1,000 for the Columbus City mean.
Yeah, and also to be very clear here, obviously it's not an apples-to-apples comparison when you talk about the data compared to different counties or different localities and then the state data. But it is important to nonetheless keep track of where you're at in the city of Columbus. So the best way we understand that we can actually have more apples-to-apples comparison is looking at the data within our own city and within our own neighborhoods. And that's where we talk about closing the gap, and that's where we can kind of eliminate some of these disparities.
Okay, would you like to walk us through this one? I can walk us through it, okay. All right, so for closing the gap, in the areas with very high vulnerability, the jail incarceration rate is 9.3. In places with high vulnerability, it's 5.6. Moderate is 3.6, low is 2.8, and very low is 0.6. So that means those kids that are experiencing vulnerability in somewhere like Linden have experienced a community that has a 9.3 jail incarceration rate per 1,000. Whereas if you look at somewhere like Northwest Columbus, it's 0.6. So it's over 10 times as much, depending on the neighborhood. And these trends appear in every single indicator. So violent crime incidences, the very high neighborhoods are 16.1, as opposed to very low where it's 1.7. And most stark I find in this in the safety domain is the gun crime incidences, where at very high it's 5.6. And in very low, it's 0.3, meaning that if you live in somewhere like Linden or the South Side that has a very high rate of vulnerability, you're experiencing gun crime rates at a incidence that's over 15 times as much as a very low area.
And what's important about all this is we want to make sure that you understand that at the top we highlight total youth population, youth of color population, and boys and young men of color population. And the why that's important is because you understand and you can actually see that disproportionately youth of color and boys and young men of color are living in these areas of high or very high vulnerability, and which is why closing and tracking these disparities are important. And so as you look at these as you look at both raising the bar and closing the gap and these domains, it's important to figure out, okay, well, these are numbers, these are indicators. We want to make sure we're grounded in this data. But at the end of the day, we understand that indicators alone are not going to solve the problems. It's important to keep track of these numbers, but instead our focus is more so focused on the entire domain. And that's why you're all here today. How can we leverage our community assets to address issues of safety? And we understand that you can't necessarily go after one indicator, but we can affect an entire domain. That's why we have folks working in spaces of all sorts of areas, And so we're going to pass it off to Javier, who's actually going to tell us a little bit about
May I say
the
something real quick?
process.
May I say
Yeah,
something
go
real
for it.
quick? I also want to make it clear that while vulnerability is experienced unequitably in Columbus, there are tons of resources and engagements that happen in areas with very high vulnerability. So just because a child lives in very high vulnerability doesn't mean there's not resources that are available, and doesn't mean that they haven't built resiliency to experience those conditions. However, we feel that the people that are here tonight and all of us as a community can do better in terms of engaging with those areas of very high vulnerability, so that way we can close this gap. Thank you. All right, back to Javier.
Cool. In fact, good evening. My name is Javier Sanchez, and I have a company called Reach Communications. And a little more than 5 years ago, we did a national research, or we were part of a national research project in 5 different cities: Chicago, Philadelphia, D.C., Richmond, California, and Oakland, California, where we studied about 2,000 young people, and young people who experience trauma, violence, neglect on a daily basis. It's a regular part of their life. And what we found among those 2,000 young people was that about 15% of them were actually thriving in the midst of the trauma that they experienced every day, in the midst of these violent communities, violent neighborhoods, and even violent homes that they lived in. They were figuring out those resiliency skills and figuring out a way to thrive. And then we looked among those 2,000, the 15% of them that were thriving, we looked for consistencies among them, and what we discovered were 4. And the way we framed them were they had a strong or a significant connection to somewhere, somehow, something, and someone. The somewhere is they had a vision or an optimistic outlook on their life. The somehow was they had a plan, or they recognized the need to create a plan to rise above their circumstances. The something was a connection to a higher purpose, something to live for. And the someone was a connection to a non-parental, non-judgmental, caring adult. Or connected to programs. They were finding programs. They were finding resources in their communities, in their schools, that could help them navigate systems. And that's a key to rising above the circumstances, is developing the competency to effectively and efficiently navigate systems that they are entrenched in. And so what our goal is, that's 15% of the young people that were figuring this stuff out on their own, without interventions, without external supports, or if there were external supports, they were making the effort to reach out and connect with them. So what we're trying to be intentional about this evening, and you know, for now and you know forevermore, hopefully, is what can we do to raise that bar from 15% to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 to, you know, to who knows where. What can we, if 15% of them are figuring out on their own, what if we got intentional about creating these environments for them? So that's what tonight is about being solution-minded, and being intentional about creating a community, creating a Columbus where every young man of color knows that he is safe, knows that he is valued, and knows that he's necessary, right? If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, number 1 is safety. You know, that's our number 1 priority, is safety. And psychologists break it down like this. Our minds tend to be in one of 3 places. Spend most of our time thinking about one of 3 things: what has happened in the past, what might happen in the future, or what could be happening somewhere else. And when it comes to our young men of color, what they're thinking about a lot of times when it comes to what has happened in the past, what might happen in the future, what could be happening somewhere else, is safety. My safety, my family's safety, my friend's safety. You know, and so how can you function in school when that's where your head is? How can you function at work when that's where your head is? How can you function as a father when that's where or a brother or a son where that is where your head is constantly? And I'm speaking from experience. I was shot when I was in the 10th grade. You know, I grew up right here in Columbus. I was shot in the 10th grade. My 11th grade year, I was standing in my cafeteria at my high school. 2 20-year-olds entered the cafeteria and tried to jump me. It was all bad for them, but they made an attempt. And so, you know, I've been in that space where I had to constantly consider and wonder what was going to happen when I stepped outside my house, and or when I stepped outside of my school. So what we need to be intentional about is creating a story that that helps us create these environments where young people know they're safe, valued, and necessary. So that's what tonight is all about. We're telling a story. We're creating a story. Understand this, that a lot of times when it comes to dealing with issues in our community, we take a literate-based approach. We use literate-based traditions with an oral-based culture, right? And why do we do that a lot of times? It comes down to our fear for our safety. It's a lot safer for us to do a lit drop or to put up a billboard or to do a commercial on television than it is for us to go into those communities. You know, we're worried about our safety, so we take a literate-based approach to an oral-based culture. And so what we're going to do tonight is meet the community where they are and practice oral-based traditions and create stories. So in order to do that, we've got some goals that we want to, or some agreements that hopefully we can all agree on. Number one is to be here, be present. We all, again, we talked about where their minds are at. Guess what? Our minds are there too. We all got family at home and food we want to eat later and stuff going on in the future, in the past, and somewhere else. We can all be there too. My challenge to you all is I hope we can all agree to be present here tonight for this experience. And I want to tell you, I've been doing a time check. We're like literally right on time. Somehow we pulled this off. We are on time right now. Actually, we're ahead of time, so I'm going to shut up to keep us early. But be present. You know, actually, when we start to create our stories, I'm going to encourage you to be on your phones because we want to do a little bit of research that might require you Googling something. But for the most part, you know, let's be present, not texting, calling, or whatever. But, you know, so be mindful of that. Number two is be open. Be open to other people's ideas. Be open to other people's opinions and thoughts and perspectives. Just have an open mindset. This issue, safety, I would venture to say out of the four, is probably top priority, is the most pressing issue. Again, going back to our hierarchy of needs. This is the number one issue that we're dealing with. So people are coming from different experiences and different worldviews. Be open to worldviews. Don't, you know, try to resist defending positions and defending stances and justifying stances or rationalizing. Just be open to other people's thoughts and ideas and opinions and perspectives. And be honest. Be real. You know, real solutions come from real when you're honest. That's when, you know, let's not beat around the bush and you know, sugarcoat things. Let's just be open, honest, and real. And the last one is be solution-minded. We know what the problems are. We're well aware of those. We've documented. You know, Kerwin, you know, went out of their way to identify what the issues are. We're aware of those. We understand those. Tonight is about being solution-minded. When you focus on the problems become bigger. When you focus on the solutions become bigger. So let's, instead of magnifying the problems, let's amplify the solutions. Okay, can we all agree on these? That's agreeable? All right, cool. So, a couple things to be mindful of. And here's how this is going to go. Again, what I want us to do is I'm going to give you some questions. And these questions are just to help you create your story. So what I don't want you to do is just go through questions. Let's answer number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. We're all adults. This is an organic experience. You're in your groups right now. What I want you to do is use these questions to create your story for your solution-minded approach to addressing the issue of safety for our young boys and men of color. Okay? So the first question is, what do we know or what do we want to know about the issue of safety in regards to young men of color? What are some data? What are some facts? What are some stats? What are some stories, some real stories that you know? What is the information we know about the issue of safety for young men of color, okay? That's the first question. The second question is, how do we feel about the issue of safety in regards to young men of color? Some descriptive words and language that express how you feel. Now, I'll be honest, and I told them last night, and we're recording this, so I'm going to censor myself, but usually when I do this stuff, I curse. I use a lot of foul language. Why? And I never had I was called on it one time, and then one of my mentors said, I asked him about it, and he said, look, Javier, these young men live profane lives. So if you feel like you need to use profanity, go right ahead. I'm not going to use profanity tonight, but if you need to use some descriptive language, that's between you and the council member. All right? So, but we do want you to honestly express how you feel, right? As a result of what we know and how we feel, what can we do as individuals? We got to start with the inside out. Instead of telling everybody else what they need to do, what can I or should I be doing new, different, or better as an individual myself? As a result of what we know and how we feel, what can we do collaboratively? We've been very intentional about putting you at tables with people that work in different sectors than you do. Why? Because when we take a collaborative approach, we can experience higher levels of success. So, the council member will speak to this probably afterwards. The grant process will be a collaborative initiative as well. So we need to just get in that habit of thinking collaboratively, right? And who are our allies? People or programs already involved or potentially interested? What are our resources in terms of messengers, programs, support, spaces, and supplies? And what can we start doing new, different, or better right now? What are 3 things we can do new, different, or better right now? Get creative. Our goal, and here's one thing I want you to do. The first thing when you get to your paper, I want you to do is put a $sign on there, a big $sign at the top, and then put a big 0 right next to it, okay? Now, we've already let the cat out the bag. There is grant money coming down the line here in the future. But it'll never be enough. But let's not start there. Let's start with the number 0. That's when you can be your most creative, your most innovative, right? I come from hip-hop, and if you know anything about hip-hop came from nothing. African Bambaataa, Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, they did not get grants. They did not get seed money to start to create this multi-billion-dollar industry. They started with nothing and created something amazing. So it takes starting with nothing forces you to use your imagination, forces you to use your innovation, and forces you to collaborate and work together to figure these things out. So be intentional about that. And that's how the conversation will go. So it is, wow, this is like magic. 6:45 right now. You have the next 45 minutes until 7:30. You're going to keep your own time because we're all responsible adults. You have the next 45 minutes to create a story for what we can do, new, different, or better, to impact safety, to create a Columbus where young men of color know they are safe, valued, and necessary. All right? Does anybody have any questions? Or does anything need clarified?
Before we got into the groups, I did want to speak to the gentleman who had a question about some of the statistics, if I may.
Yep.
And not to get off topic, but one of the growing concerns that may come up is myself and Officer Johnson, obviously are Columbus police officers, and we are starting to see an increasingly higher number of levels of violence with young women of color. Mm-hmm. And I know today we're here to address only specifically the young men of color, but I'm just curious, have you guys started any research on that in terms of young women of color and as far as crime?
So specifically, on that specific question. So as far as the data itself, it's the entire city of Columbus data, but one of the instances that of why we've really highlighted youth of color as well is because we understand that oftentimes these boys and young men are also growing up and going to the same schools, the same neighborhoods as young women of color as well. So while the data itself is just centered around the city of Columbus and that census tract in general, there certainly does need to be more research and focus, which is one of the points that we're going to highlight as part of the Kerwin report, which is, while boys and young men of color is a focus, we also need to be looking at girls and young women of color as well. Thank you.
So before we get started in your groups, let's go around really quickly and just have everyone introduce yourself, your name, and who you're representing, and then we'll get started.
My name is Alicia Wilkes. I represent the Columbus Urban League. I serve as one of the directors in the African American Male Initiative.
James Fuqua, Columbus Police Department. I am a patrol sergeant, but I also serve as the division's diversity and inclusion liaison for the African American community.
Hi, I'm Napoleon Belt. I'm with the Putnam County Sheriff's Office. I'm the community liaison and recruiting manager.
Good evening. My name is Amber Evans. I'm here with the Juvenile Justice Coalition.
Mario Martin, City of Columbus Recreation Parks Administrator and Family Development Division.
Olitha Wall, Columbus Urban League, African American Male Initiative.
Good evening. I'm Marian Specky. I'm with Columbus Public Health and the Columbus Care Coalition.
My name is Olga Augustine. I'm with the Columbus Council of PTAs. I'm also the mother of an African American male and a community member.
I'm Grant Ames. I'm from Councilmember Mitchell Brown's office.
Anthony Johnson, Columbus Police Department, huge advocate of community policing and effects of hazard community.
Sean Stevenson, Mr. in the Violence Community Advocate.
And I'll highlight a couple of folks on my team, Zach Davidson and Linda Capobianco, who helped pull this together. Deputy Director Derek Anderson with Department of Neighborhoods. Deputy Director, is here, and I appreciate you, Director Stewart, for being here. And at the end, I'll have you say a few words too. We would not be here without the support and direction of Director Stewart and the Department of Public Safety, so I appreciate them. And then Ms. Denise with Foster, with Councilmember Brown's office as well. And like Councilmember Tyson said, Councilmember Brown would be here, but for a family emergency. So with that, I think we can.
So at this time, again, use innovation, imagination, and improvisation to create a story on what we can do to create a Columbus where young men of color know they're safe, valued, and necessary. I see this group. I think if we start with you all, we set the bar really high because they actually have a story created. So do you all mind going first?
All right, so our group identified that a huge issue with safety is policing and trust within police officers. So there's a disconnect between young men of color and police. There's a need for community policing and having officers tied to the community they serve. This to include the hiring of officers, trust between officers and the community needs to strengthen. We're gonna do this.
My job was the flip.
Oh, okay. She's the flipper. Okay. So we have to do a better job of understanding the cultures where these young men of color come from, officers meaning us. We have to break the stereotype of fear when it comes to the police. This makes us feel very frustrated, aggravated, angry, helpless, a need to change. And we're very passionate about the subject. So what we're going to do is we're going to influence the influencer, aka the alpha. We're going to work with the community, and we are going to be aware of what's going on in our communities. And then we are going to, let's see what we got here. Those who provide the influence. Oh, these are our allies. Okay. He wrote all this down. So our allies are those who provide the influence. We're going to turn the negative leaders into the positive ones. We're going to engage community workers. We're going to engage the young people, the school system, the parents, the police, and government leaders. Oh, yeah, these are more influencers. So people with a past who are ready to make a difference, i.e. like convicted felons or whatnot. Coaches in the media is also a huge influencer. Resources, since we don't have no money, what we came up with is the Columbus Police would be a very financial way to go about doing this, working with community agencies, elected official, the City of Columbus, through grant programs, Franklin County, and Jobs and Family Services. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a targeted program for minority police, along with an affordable housing program to address the couch surfing issue. And we're also going to create a community intervention team on violence. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the leaders and the influence, and we're going to listen to what they have to say. Because they're the best, or they understand what's going on in the community. What we're going to do better is we are going to watch how we intentionally recruit minorities and young men of color. And what we are going to do differently is realign resources and pay attention to our young people and invite them to the conversation.
You did a good job.
In our group, I'm going to draw something in a second. In our group, we talked about how a lot of the pitfalls in young people of color, particularly men of color, is coming from the untreated trauma and grief that they experience, and then how that is reflected or mirrored in terms of violent retaliation, in terms of self-medication through drug use, and particularly thinking about how there's a breakdown of families. So we talked about how some young men of color, particularly their caregivers, are connected to incarceration, how a lot of them have experienced the loss of a loved one, and how that is reflected in our communities based on all of these different resources and gaps that exist because direct service providers, community members, educators, schools, courts are not talking to one another. Do you want to add to that? I can draw.
I think one of the overriding themes that came out of, and what probably tells our story best, is that we all realize the importance, we realize the need, but what it came down to is, are we going to continue to work in our silos in the city of Columbus, or are we going to come out and start working together? Because you look at cities that are having any success in creating safety and reducing violence, what you're finding is that they have went through the difficulty of starting to sit in rooms and share information and come out of those silos. And to me, that's really what it comes down to, and other people shared in the same thing, is that we have to come out to silos and work together, because that's really where the impact is going to happen. We're going to have minimal success separately, but for us to really make the change and have the impact that we want, we're going to have to come together. And that's really what it comes down to. And what I mean by that is us sharing information sometimes, especially when we talk about safety. APPS has to communicate with law enforcement. We have to communicate with probation. We have to communicate with Drug Task Force if we want to start to address these issues in the communities. We all have roles that are extremely important, but those roles need to come together to make a difference. So what we're looking at is when we create different groups that will work together, but it's about sharing information. And it's not about funding, it's not about personal agendas, it's about doing what's best for our kids and our communities. And we have to put that at the forefront, and I know we all have challenges in areas of politics and things of that sort, but we have to be willing to do this if we're ever going to get to where we need to be as a city. And that's really what it comes down to. We can write charts, we can continue to meet, but until people are willing to do that, we're going to kind of stay in the same place. And, you know, when people are saying we've kind of been doing this same thing for 20, 25 years, which was shared at my table, that kind of tells you where we're at. And when you look nationally, you look at other cities that are having success, you look at Oakland, you look at Boston, you look at some of the success that they're having, they'll tell you that first 4 or 5 years of getting all levels of law enforcement, social service agencies, and political figures involved, it was very difficult going through that process. But they said going through it and getting to the other side is really where they were able to make a difference in their city.
And so one thing that we also lifted was the fact that presently a lot of our systems are incredibly punitive. And so it doesn't really give space for us to address the root cause and the root issue of what's actually happening so we can stop seeing this repetitive cycle. One suggestion in order to do so is how do we actually have schools, direct service providers, courts and law enforcement, community residents that are directly impacted by the issue of safety from the four corners, with community-based organizations, and then faith. And then how are they actively talking to one another so that we can start to break down some of those silos? And having representatives from each of those different groups then be a part of this collaborative table to start to address, again, the root cause of what's happening.
The first question was, what do we know? So some of the things that we know, some of the facts are men of color fear for their lives. Because of this fear, organizations have been created around the nation, things like Black Lives Matter, and their fear has been heightened from the death of some of our African American young men around the country. Celebrities have even reacted, and the tension is growing in our community with things like the kneeling for the national anthem. Some of the celebrities have come out and spoken about it. So our nation is in they're heightened with the security issue that we're having now. More diversity, we know that more diversity and training for police officers, cultural training is needed in our police officer with our police officers around the nation. No sense of safety amongst men in the community as a whole. That's what my brother here, brought out, because he works with some of the young men in our community right now, hands-on, face-to-face. He said that it's internal terrorism. It's happening right in our neighborhoods, amongst us, amongst our own community, and amongst the boys against each other. External perception of reality versus reality. So people's perception is their reality. And so even if they haven't had interactions with police officers based on what's going on with the community, they fear their safety just based on what they're seeing around the world.
So a lot of the stuff that we have up here was already covered in some of the other groups. But that sense of hopelessness, we talked about the absence of fathers and the impact that has, because what we've seen in our work is that we have one of two things happen. Either you have a productive male role model, a father in the home, or you are looking for that father figure, and then when that person who could have been incarcerated comes home, then he brings that prison mentality back. And so we see our communities become extensions of the prison yard, where we come back and teach you that abusing your woman emotionally, physically, verbally, then gets transferred, that this is a rite of passage, that you're getting arrested or getting shot or the first time you get high, that these are things that you should aspire to do. And this further erodes that sense of safety and robs that male role model of his ability to be effective. So all our feelings, hopelessness, but there were some points of hope, opportunity. Officer Fuqua brought up, though, that instant gratification is something that we see in our young people, and that's something that we're going to have to talk to them about so that we can help them be more effective in planning, because planning doesn't happen instantly. All right. So our collaborations through leadership academies, mentoring, city year in schools, I Know I Can, Fathers in Training, something that we do, working with Father to Father, and working right on the corners with credible messengers is something else that we talked about. Guys that can actually go into the neighborhood and make an impact. All of our different community groups that have already been mentioned. I don't think Boys and Girls Club was mentioned. Ohio State. Coach Meyer, we are fortunate here in Columbus to have a giant like Ohio State in our community. And Coach Meyer has actually said that this is one of the biggest problems that he sees are the problems that are faced by our community. Our guys getting high, tremendous athletes ended up in the penitentiary that could come and both be mentors and also have a positive impact. Absolutely. Yes, so this is where we're going right now. Sister Lolita was just mentioning restored citizens and that collaboration between restored citizens and law enforcement. I call myself personally a resurrected citizen because I was actually dead on the streets. Cadet programs inside of our communities and opportunities for police and fire to be in schools and engaging with our youth in their day-to-day lives. Some things we want to do new and better. Increase minority participation in law enforcement. Emphasis on the CQE, the collateral barriers, collateral sanctions that exist for restored citizen into some of the most needed spaces like schools. I would love to be working as a math teacher or a science teacher at Beatty Park or at South Scioto, where them guys are not going to be able to run that game on me because I know what that looks like. And we can go ahead and break down those barriers and get them to start looking at themselves. Long-term employment, financial literacy classes, teaching our kids what the result of squandering their summer youth employment money looks like. So you work 4 summers and you still don't have a car. You still don't have your driver's license or your state ID. Proper communication with police, this is huge. And then the trauma conversation, and then teaching law in schools. We talked about the idea that government is not necessarily something that I paid attention in, but if I had known that I was going to get what time for an ounce of crack or having a gun on me, then that would have potentially had a different impact on some of my decision making.
So the only thing that I think that is missing, we want to make sure that we stand out that our restored citizens are one of our #1 resources, because those are the guys that the kids know and they will relate to. Also, one of the things that we can add to is asking the kids, what should we do? Asking the kids how we should respond and what's some solutions, because we never ask the children. And like like Director Carla said today, we need to ask the children, what should we do? They're not dumb. My kids are really smart, and they're paying attention. They're active. They're more active than they used to be. They're very vocal, and so that's what we wanted to add.
And one more thing, and the trauma-informed care and trauma-informed care, trauma-informed education, the physiological response to trauma, that some of these kids are not just behaving in this way because they choose to, but because physiologically you get trapped in a certain part of your brain from repeated trauma, and they're not able to use those higher brain functions. So I really want to commend our community for putting an emphasis through the CARE Coalition and through a lot of the trainings that are going on inside the community and in law enforcement around trauma. So understanding that a dog that's been beaten will bite. So I really want to just put an emphasis there as well.
We're done. Just quick 30 seconds. I want to publicly acknowledge somebody fairly quickly about work that they do in the community here every day. You know, the thing with law enforcement is, you know, this is definitely a very trying time in our community specifically and across the United States of America with law enforcement and the problems that we're having with the community. There's a lot of things that we can do better, and we're continuing to strive to make them better. That's why myself and Officer Johnson is here. So I just wanted to publicly acknowledge the work that Officer Anthony Johnson does in the community. He, a couple weeks ago, well, maybe it's been a couple months ago now, brought an organization to Columbus called Humanize the Badge. This group is a bunch of officers from all over the country, San Diego, Philadelphia, Michigan, where else? Texas, Colorado. These officers come on their own time, come to a community where they don't even know anyone, and they personally get involved and get active. We did a community kickball game, we did dodgeball, water gun fight. The point is, we try to humanize ourselves to people in the community and make sure that they know we're normal just like them, that we put our pants on the same way they do. We just have a job that's a little unique, but I just want to publicly acknowledge and thank him for the work that he did, because that was such a huge success, and I just want to just clap it up for him. So thank you. So some of the people in the community have heard my story at this point in life, but others haven't, so I'll just quickly go through it. I am a lifelong resident of Columbus, grew up on the south side. You know, proud bulldog, proud bulldog. And, yeah. Or, okay, Tiger's in here, okay. Ridge, much respect to everybody. You know, we all together. Anyway, I grew up in a single-parent household primarily because when I was 12 years old, my father had a lot of mental illness that we were unaware of, and he committed suicide. It was very traumatic, obviously, for me because I felt like it was my fault, the oldest of 2 brothers and a sister. And, you know, I felt a lot of guilt for a lot of years because when my mom and dad had split up, I was a primary cause of wanting to go live with him because I didn't want to be on the south side because at that point he was living somewhere a little bit nicer. And I just always thought financially I was the reason why. So I had a lot of guilt for a lot of years that, you know, he killed himself because of me, you know. So I carried that anger back with me to the south side. And I started developing some bad habits and hanging with some people doing some very questionable things. The funny thing is, I always like to joke, because I can laugh about it now, I tried to be a drug dealer for like 30 seconds, and that lasted about 15 of those 30 seconds because I realized fairly quickly that I was kind of soft. But the whole point is, you know, I grew up in the inner city, single-parent household. I've been shot before. I've been stabbed. I've been robbed at gunpoint. I mean, I check all the boxes that we talked about here earlier today. So you wonder, how does someone who's been through so much trauma in their life make it to the point where I am today? And the point is, like you were talking about, I had the someone, and I had the something inside of me, and that's so very true, that I had someone looking out for me that kept me out of trouble, kept me on the straight and narrow. And I think it's so important today that everybody in this room is accountable. I'm not worried about anybody else out there, but every single person in here, I don't care where you live, if you have kids, what you do, you need to find that person that was like me growing up, where I didn't have anything. And I had a lot of strikes against me, and I could have been another statistic. But thankfully, I had that someone, and I had that something that kept me out of trouble. So to this day, I personally make sure on my own time that I find kids that were just like me, and I continually am with them in school. I give them a call, you know, money out of my own pocket. I'm not expecting anybody to do any financial commitments, but the point of what I'm saying is I make a point to give back, because if I'm not going to do it, we could all sit here all day long and talk about what we can do in the solutions base, but if you're not personally doing it, then what are we all doing here? So I just wanted to share that quickly, and I thank everybody.
I just want to say that it really has been, it was enlightening just to be at the table that I was sitting at and listening to the different comments, but then listening to the overall comments that when each group made their presentations. It just, you know, once you gather information, you have to do something with it. You have to do something with it. And so my commitment is certainly working with my colleagues to, as we continue to gather information, our commitment, my personal commitment is to make sure that I'm working to make Columbus a better place for our young men of color. Everyone absolutely should be able to live their best quality of life. And so we have got to make sure that we go from what we look at the people who have very few, I don't know what's the right word, the vulnerability, that we have to make sure that we have to close the gap and we have to raise the bar. And that's my commitment in working with my colleagues. And thank you for all being here and just sharing information.
Thank you, and I didn't expect this. Thanks, Council Member. But as I share with the folks at my table, we're the superstars. We're the people who need to come up with the decisions here. Officer Johnson, I mean, we patted these guys on the back. Nobody, or very few people realize that when he started doing the things he's doing for his community, without fanfare, without anybody forcing him to do that, he just felt a need to do it. I don't know how Harvard found out about it, but he was invited twice, 3 times to Harvard to stand and lecture students at Harvard University on how to interact with, how to connect with the people of the community. Now, I've seen him dance. Let's not go there. But these are the types of things that these are everyday guys. These are just cops. But at the same time, they're the heroes. They're the role models. They're the folks we need to put in positions of leadership and for direction because they've done it. Sergeant Fuqua, he's done it. He's lived it. I trained him at the training academy. You know, I knew what his story was, and I always just, I marveled at how this kid was able to come through and end up being where he is. And he's a sergeant now. And I'm so proud of him I can't see straight. I wouldn't have told him that a few years ago in the academy, but I am. And these are the kind of folks that we need to latch on to and help direct. Napoleon Bell, same thing. Former Columbus police officer. Look what he's done. All right, listen to the folks who have been there. Listen to the folks who are making the difference. That's all I can say. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Director. Just quickly, and this is closing. We're getting out of here at 8:02. Just want to say thank you again to President Pro Tem Tyson, to Councilmember Brown and his team, to Public Safety, to everybody in this room, to my department, Department of Neighborhoods, and Director Carla Williams-Scott. So in December, we will release the current report. We'll also announce the MBK Grants Program. This conversation, along with conversations on health, poverty, and education, will help to create the criteria for the grants program. There are many folks in the community who have been doing this work for many years, so it is essential for us to lift up all of the groups, helping small to medium-sized nonprofits and community members expand their reach and capacity so that they can address the issues in the community. Serving our vulnerable young people is something that our entire city can rally around, and every organization can contribute. I was telling my table that this idea in our story was about collaboration. That when we rolled out MBK, one of the biggest issues that we ran into was this silo issue, that we, throughout the term MBK, and folks started asking, well, is that, we're MBK? I thought you were MBK. Who's MBK? And I was not expecting that, truthfully. We were taken aback by it because everybody had an MBK effort. And so through this process, a couple of things. One, we want to change the conversation from who is MBK to what is your MBK, because we should all have a personal commitment to improving the lives of young men of color. So our MBK is not the MBK. No one has an MBK, or no one has their own MBK. It's all of our MBK. And I challenge you as individuals, as organizations, to have an MBK effort of your own and see how we can work together. And then the second point I would make is that this is now MBK, let it be synonymous with our city's commitment to our young men of color, that this is our commitment to you, that we will have your back, that it is not a one-off program, that it is not a one-off initiative. It will live on throughout our city and throughout each one of us. And so the grants program is just a next little iteration of it. That's not the end of it. Like when we roll that out, folks will be like, oh, this was all for a couple $100,000. No, that is a piece of the MBK pie. And a piece of our ongoing commitment. And so I just encourage all of you to stay engaged. I encourage folks who are watching at home to engage and help us come up. We need as many viewpoints, engagement as possible. Like I said, we have, what are our next two?
Health and education.
So on November 28th, we are having a session around education, and on November 30th, we're having a conversation on health. And so we will have these same breakout conversations, and then we will roll out the full program. But I thank each and every one of you for being here this evening. God bless.